All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Philosopher Meets Critics. I'm Paul Silva, junior professor here at the University of Cologne and Concept. I'll be your host for today and the chair of today's event. And the event today is institutionally hosted by the University of Cologne and the Federal University of Bahia in Brazil. I'm really thrilled to have the opportunity to introduce today's author, Endre Begby. He's an associate professor of philosophy at Simon Fraser in Canada. He has numerous publications in philosophy. His papers include Straight Thinking in Warped Environments, Evidential Preemption, The Epistemology of Prejudice, Doxastic Morality, Deranging the Mental Lexicon, and many other neat papers with provocative content and titles. Today's topic is his book, published with Oxford. Softback, I heard, is coming, titled Prejudice, A Study in Non-Ideal Epistemology. And critics for today. So our first critic today will be Giulia Napolitano. She's a postdoctoral fellow at UNC Chapel Hill. She recently received her PhD from Irvine. Renée Jorgensen, an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Michigan, and Professor Tom Kelly, a professor of philosophy at Princeton. In terms of format, what we'll do is Endre will give a brief 15-minute summary of his book. Each critic will have about 10 minutes to issue their remarks. And after each critic, Endre will have about 5 minutes to respond. And we'll postpone dialogue between author and critics until all the critics have had a chance to give their prepared remarks and Endre his responses. And the aim for today is to conclude at about the 2-hour mark. And that's how things will roughly proceed. And with that, I'm very pleased to be able to give the floor to Endre. Please tell us about your book.
So first of all, yeah, thanks to Paul, thanks to organizers at the Cologne Concept Center for setting up this wonderful event. Thanks to Renée, to Giulia, to Tom for agreeing to serve as critics. And thanks also to anyone who's logging in to listen in live or who might be watching this recording later on YouTube. I'd certainly be interested in hearing from any of you if you have any questions, concerns, ideas, and so on. So please feel very encouraged to get in touch. I've prepared some slides. So I am going to share my screen. Right, yeah, so I wrote a book. Came out last year, as Paul just said. It's coming out in paperback. Here is a advanced copy that I received only last week. Yeah, it is a book in social epistemology, and its central theme is that of prejudice belief. Now, for obvious reasons, I think that's an important and timely focus, but in another sense, I also want to emphasize that prejudice is really just sort of an example or a case study. I think many of the same kinds of arguments that are deployed in the book could also be levied in consideration of the epistemology of conspiracy theories or fake news or climate skepticism or what have you, really. I think what matters philosophically, or what sort of brings all of these examples together, is that they are instances of beliefs that we tend to think of not simply as false beliefs, but as somehow deeply wrong-headed, right? So there's just so much evidence out there in the world to counteract these beliefs. So if you hold any such beliefs, then it seems you must be doing something wrong, epistemically speaking. So the book aims to do a lot of things, but perhaps the thing that it aims to do most centrally, right, is to ask whether these sorts of off-the-cuff philosophical reactions are really philosophically warranted. And as you'll probably have guessed, my answer is going to be that they probably are not. Right, so to start us off, I'm going to provisionally define a prejudice as a negatively charged stereotype that targets some group of people, and derivatively the individuals who comprise this group. I think that's a reasonably fair reflection of the way that most philosophers and psychologists tend to think about it today. Of course, there's lots of other things also characteristically going on with prejudice as well. So for instance, affect. But if we're doing the epistemology of prejudice, then it seems most natural to focus on this doxastic component, the belief part of it. Now, that makes for something like a descriptive account of prejudice, if you will. So then we can ask how things look from the more normative perspective of epistemology. And a common view among both philosophers and laypersons, I think, is that there's something intrinsically epistemically irrational, or at least sort of subpar, about prejudice beliefs understood in this way. So no one could be epistemically justified in holding a prejudice belief. And for a prominent example, you could consider Miranda Fricker, who writes that the idea of a prejudice is most naturally interpreted as a judgment made or maintained without proper regard to the evidence. And for that reason, as she puts it in a later work, we must surely start with the assumption that we are epistemically culpable for allowing prejudice into our thinking. Now, I mentioned Fricker here specifically because she is very central to much of this literature, and because she is perhaps the most explicit about this assumption. But you can find similar things also in the works of a lot of other philosophers. So basically, anyone whose first instinct, whenever they hear about prejudice belief or conspiracy theories or what it might be, is to set about sort of explaining what's wrong with it, or how could people be so irrational, etc. Now, as I've come to think of it, this kind of view really cannot be sustained. And to see why, I'd like to start by talking a little bit about my broader sort of methodological orientation in the project. So many of the phenomena that fall under the rubric of social epistemology, including but not limited to prejudice belief, I think are best studied from the perspective of non-ideal epistemology. And in the book, I distinguish between two dimensions of non-ideality. So first, there's going to be a form of endogenous non-ideality that arises from processing limitations inherent to the cognitive system itself, for instance, in the form of limited computational powers or limited working memory, and so on. And then second, a form of exogenous non-ideality, which arises from limitations on the information environment that the cognitive subject is forced to operate within. Now, since time is going to be limited today, I'm going to be focusing primarily on the second dimension here. But briefly, I do want to say a little bit about the first as well. So remember how we provisionally define prejudice in terms of stereotyping. So the reason for foregrounding the endogenous dimension of non-ideality is to make the claim that reliance on stereotype reasoning is a fundamental architectural feature of human cognition. So we can really no more get by without it than we can get by without, say, object categorization. So, thinking of objects as blue or as round or whatever. Indeed, on the view that I take, we should think about stereotype reasoning simply as the manifestation of categorization in the domain of social cognition. So obviously, we can make a number of epistemic errors in stereotype reasoning, just like we can in any form of reasoning. But the fact that a mode of reasoning involves stereotyping at all is not, as such, I think, a reason to object to it on epistemic grounds. All right, so let's move on to what I call exogenous non-ideality then. So here's a basic idea that I hope many of you can get behind. So by and large, what is rational for you to believe depends on what kind of information you have access to. And to a very large extent, what kind of information you have access to depends on what kind of social environment you find yourself in. I think of that as pretty much the foundational insight of social epistemology, if you will. So it may be that no prejudice belief could ever be justified in light of all of the information, let's say, if only because we typically presume that these are false beliefs. But on the other hand, none of us could ever hope to form our beliefs in light of all of the information, whether it's because we have finite minds or because we live relatively short lives. So in this sense, belief formation construed as inference from evidence is always going to be an inherently sort of risky affair. So we only ever get to see, right, a limited subset of the evidence. And for all we can know, that subset could be biased, could be misleading, etc. So if epistemology is about decision-making under uncertainty, which I like to think that it is, and certainly I would say that non-ideal epistemology would have to be, then we naturally look to epistemic norms for guidance here, but it's important to recognize that these norms can really only serve to mitigate the risks, right? They can't eliminate the risks altogether. Now, if what is rational for you to believe depends on what kind of information you have access to, then I take it to be obvious that we can imagine various kinds of interventions on your evidential situation that would also dramatically affect what it would be rational for you to believe. So simple and well-studied example of this kind of intervention would be that of providing you with testimony. So right now, you may have no particular grounds for believing anything about the weather in Vancouver, but if I tell you that it's currently sunny, for instance, then I've manipulated your information environment in a very simple way that, given reasonable background assumptions, will also change what is rational for you to believe. I will add, I suppose, that I don't think that has anything in particular to do with the question of whether it's in fact sunny in Vancouver right now, or whether I know that it's sunny and so forth, right? What matters is that you have reason to believe that I'm speaking knowledgeably and that what I'm saying is true. All right, so I hope these methodological reflections are sufficient to make plausible that in order to determine whether a prejudiced belief could be epistemically justified, we can't just look at the representational format of the belief, or the fact that it involves stereotyping, say, or at the content of the belief, so the fact that it's a prejudice of a certain form. We also have to look at the evidential context in which that belief arose, what kind of evidence the subject would plausibly have had access to, and so forth. And in this sense, as I argue in the book, we ought to construe epistemic norms as attaching primarily to the process of belief formation and only derivatively to the beliefs that serve as the outputs or the product of this kind of process. So once we take into account the way that prejudiced beliefs tend to sort of consolidate themselves in larger social structures, and the way that they're filtered through testimony provided within educational or familial context, for instance, then I think that sweeping dismissals of the form that we find in Fricker and others can become really hard to sustain. So to be sure, right, some prejudiced beliefs are no doubt poorly formed. That is to say, they are made or maintained without proper regard to the evidence, as Fricker says. Possibly lots of prejudiced beliefs are poorly formed in this way. But then again, that doesn't seem to make prejudiced belief in any way special, right? So pretty much any kind of belief, including our scientific beliefs, I think, are apt to be poorly formed in just these kinds of ways. So the sweeping generalization that there's something inherently epistemologically suspicious about prejudiced beliefs just can't be sustained without a much closer investigation of the kinds of evidential contexts in which people might plausibly form these beliefs. So to see this in more detail, I like to draw a distinction between acquisition and maintenance. All right, so this is a distinction that is rarely explicitly marked in the literature, but I think it's really quite important, both here and in epistemology more generally. So it's a distinction then between epistemological questions that pertain to the initial acquisition of a belief and epistemological questions pertaining to the continued maintenance or the retention, if you will, of these beliefs in the face of new evidence. Right? So standard discussions in these areas tend to appeal, sometimes to considerations of the first sort, sometimes to consideration of the second sort, without typically stopping to ask whether there really is a single set of epistemological considerations that govern both of them. So I think that there are good reasons to keep these issues apart. I think in an obvious sense, coming to form a belief in light of a first bit of evidence is a very different matter from continuing to hold that belief in the face of mounting contrary evidence. All right, so for a simple example, I'd consider the difference between coming to believe in August that your team might win the league this year, and then failing to update that belief as the season wears on, right? So you got 3 games to go and you're 10 points behind or something like that. So clearly at that point, you're doing something wrong. So on the first hand, then we could think about the claim, the target view, as I've called it, as the idea that no one could rationally come to acquire these beliefs in the first place. But on reflection, that claim just seems incredible to me, right? So these beliefs are formed your mother's knee. They're formed in school under significant peer pressure and so on. So then, like, take some person at any stage of their epistemic career, and then ask, can we really not imagine any situation under which it would be reasonable for them to form prejudiced beliefs? And I think the answer must be, of course we could. So to my mind, the real challenge here lies in the epistemology of prejudice maintenance, right? However one might come to hold any of these beliefs in the first place, perhaps under extremely constrained or manipulated access to information, there remains the sense that no one could really continue to hold these beliefs for very long in light of the abundance of contrary evidence that they're faced with as they go on with their everyday lives. So there's just too much evidence out there, right? In anyone's normal course of experience, for one to rationally maintain one's prejudiced beliefs. So if you remain prejudiced, it could only be because you're neglecting evidence or exhibiting significant bias in accounting for this evidence and so on. So in other words, just like Fricker says, you'd be exhibiting some kind of epistemic culpability. So a much discussed example here is Nomi Arpali's Solomon example. I guess I should add, like many of these sort of stock go-to examples, I feel like this one too has sort of lost a little bit of its sheen over the years. I guess when you sort of keep repeating these examples over and over, they will necessarily come to sort of feel a bit rigged and stylized over time. So just want to flag this, that the book deploys a wide range of different kinds of examples, bringing similar analysis to them. But I'm going to stick with a familiar example here precisely because it is familiar. And I also want to note that, Fricker herself incorporated this example into the argument of epistemic injustice, which is where I first came across it. All right, so the example is that of Solomon. So Solomon is a boy who lives in a small, isolated farming community in a poor country, who believes that women are not half as competent as men when it comes to abstract thinking, or at least not inclined towards such thinking. Now, it's interesting to note, right, that Arpali seems to concede that Solomon may well be epistemically justified in first coming to believe that women are intellectually inferior to men, given the socio-epistemic context that he grows up in. But then things are supposed to change with a second step of the example, in which we're to imagine that then Solomon receives and accepts an entrance fellowship to the university. And at the university, he then regularly interacts with women who display a strong aptitude for abstract thinking. So we are then supposed to ask, so how is Solomon supposed to deal with this new evidence? And Arpali argues that if Solomon now persists in thinking that women are inferior to men in the realm of abstract thinking, it could really only be because he is epistemically irrational, right? He's not properly updating his belief in light of this new evidence. Now, what should we think about this? So in general, I hope we can agree that it would be quite irrational of us to just automatically abandon our beliefs as soon as we run into any kind of contrary evidence. And I think any theory that counsels us to do that is just going to be a bad theory. Right? Instead, what is rational to believe at any point depends on the balance of one's total evidence, and that balance can strongly favor P, even in recognition that we also have evidence that not P. But also, I think it's important to recognize that our assessment of the significance of new evidence does not occur in a vacuum, as it were, but is often, and I think rightly so, deeply influenced by what we already believe. Right? So for instance, imagine a coin toss. How you should respond to a sequence of 5 straight heads is going to importantly depend on whether you started out with reason to think that the coin was fair. And I think we see this sort of thing like in science all the time. So you might imagine, or sorry, you might recall in 2011, scientists appeared to record neutrinos moving faster than the speed of light. And you might also recall, how did they respond to that? Well, it wasn't by looking for ways to revise the theory of special relativity, right? It was by trying to find the source of the measurement error, which they then promptly did. So in this kind of case, right, it's just much more likely that the evidence is anomalous or misleading than that your theory would be false. Now, I say that because I think it's important to note that Solomon really doesn't need to do anything quite as radical as to say, hey, my theory is true, therefore this evidence must be false. Contrary to our Pauli, I think that he can in fact accept the evidence as evidence, but still rationally maintain his prejudiced belief that women are intellectually inferior to men. And to see how, we can sort of attempt to tally in a rough and ready way the kind of evidence that would be available to him once he has entered the university. So first, then, there is the robust testimonial evidence from his upbringing that women are less intelligent than men. Then there is his personally acquired empirical evidence from interactions with women in his community that appears to confirm this testimonial evidence. And note that no one so far has drawn into question, right, his epistemic entitlement to rely on this evidence in forming his belief initially. And then finally, there's the several positive instances of female intelligence that he encounters at the university. So our question then is, does this last batch of evidence require him to abandon his prejudice against women? And in my view, no. The evidence that he now acquires can be shown to be quite compatible with his prejudice, right? In fact, on plausible assumptions, it's predicted by it. And the reason is simple enough, right? The intelligent women that Solomon encounters at the university do not represent a random sample of the female population. Instead, they're a skewed sample, largely selected for the trait in question, namely intelligence. So we can, I suppose, imagine Solomon reasoning something like the following way, right? So while women are on average less intelligent than men, some women are more intelligent than others. Some are indeed so intelligent as to be the functional peers of all but the most brilliant men. If one's going to run into any of these women anywhere, presumably be at the university. So in that sense, the current evidence is in fact predicted by his prejudice, along with plausible background assumptions. So if he were epistemically warranted in holding his prejudiced belief prior to entering the university, there's just no clear reason why he should be required to revise it subsequently. It's just not the case that Solomon's previously acquired evidence is somehow rendered void as he encounters these new instances of intelligent women. Instead, it remains active in the background and I think reasonably controls his interpretation of the new evidence that he acquires. Now, it could be convenient to state this sort of point in terms of credences rather than outright beliefs. So basically, we're to imagine that you come into the scenario with a certain degree of rational confidence in your beliefs based on your evidence, that is to say, based on whatever it was that justified you in acquiring the belief initially. And now you encounter some new evidence. How should this new evidence impact your beliefs? So essentially, we might well agree then that Solomon should recognize his new evidence as providing disconfirming evidence. So what follows from that? Well, presumably, and to a first approximation, what follows is that he should respond by decreasing his confidence in his prejudiced belief. But then again, right, depending on his starting point, it might well be that he should, nonetheless, epistemically speaking, remain prejudiced even after adjusting for this new evidence, because given his priors, the adjustment might leave him solidly and rationally confident that his prejudiced belief is true, even if he is marginally less confident than he was before. So I think that illustrates the importance of distinguishing questions of belief acquisition from questions of belief maintenance in light of new evidence. So we've assumed that there may be nothing wrong with his forming the prejudiced beliefs in the first place. And now we must assume that he can have done everything right in updating on new evidence, but he still remains prejudiced. So one can be prejudiced then and remain prejudiced, even as one also remains epistemically rational. Now, I guess I should flag that I think, in fact, that the situation might be even more complex than that, and that it's, in fact, not always the case that one is rationally required to reduce confidence in light of new evidence. In this way, that comes from a phenomenon that I call evidential preemption. So that's chapter 6 of the book and also a freestanding article. Unfortunately, I'm not going to have time to go into that here. All right, so to sum up where we are so far, I've argued that from an epistemological point of view, the claim that there's something intrinsically suspicious about prejudiced belief just cannot be sustained. I think that's quite compatible, of course, with the recognition that many and perhaps most of our prejudiced beliefs fail to meet the required evidential standards, whether it be in initial acquisition or in continued maintenance. But then again, that doesn't make prejudice belief, I think, particularly or uniquely problematic. I think, for instance, a lot of us form our scientific beliefs or our political beliefs, certainly, on types of evidence that are not hugely different from that which is in play in giving rise to prejudice belief. And I think a lot of us continue to, resist incoming evidence in very much the same sort of way. Now, of course, it could be that we are displaying our, excuse me, our epistemic irrationality in all of these contexts. But if that's the complaint, then it seems like our explanandum has changed in important ways, right? So we're then no longer particularly concerned with prejudice belief as such, but we're concerned with standard patterns of belief acquisition and belief maintenance in a much broader range of cases, specifically cases that involve taking one's basic cognitive orientation from the testimony of one's peers. So one could argue, right, that people like us are virtually never justified in forming our beliefs in this way, in which case you'd be effectively saying that social epistemology has just failed to come up with a distinctive source of epistemic justification for belief. Now, I think that's going too far. And by contrast, if you do admit that testimony from one's peers, typically testimony that is, reinforced through major social institutions, whether formal institutions like school or informal institutions like family, that this sort of testimony can justify belief, then I think we ought to accept that through no fault of one's own, one might find oneself in socio-epistemic contexts where one's evidence strongly supports the prejudiced outlook. And I think that's just part and parcel of treating the matter in terms of non-ideal epistemology. So if you're serious about this, we just have to recognize the exogenous constraints on rational belief formation and maintenance. So if you find yourself in a deeply prejudiced socio-epistemic environment, there just might be no pathway to, or rational pathway at least, to non-prejudiced belief. So that's roughly the story about the first 6 chapters of the book, the background motivations for going into the topic in the first place. In chapters 7 to 8, I provide some detailed case studies, expanding further into areas of collective epistemology and institutional epistemology. So that's stuff that I'm really quite excited about and that I hope to pursue in further work because I'm sort of more transitioning into areas of political epistemology. In the closing 2 chapters of the book, I focus on the moral consequences of these ideas. And while I can't go into great detail here, I did want to say just a few words about the direction that those arguments take. Sorry. So any account of prejudiced belief, I think, has to acknowledge competing normative pressures, competing pressures from epistemic norms on the one hand and moral norms on the other hand, because undoubtedly, right, prejudiced belief can cause moral harms, and that's presumably why we tend to single it out for special attention. And moreover, I take it to be clear that it can cause these harms irrespective of the epistemic standing of the beliefs in the first place. So throughout much of the book, I sort of work on the presumption that we can treat questions about the epistemic standing of belief first and then worry about the moral harms later. I think that resonates quite well with the traditional approach to the epistemology of prejudice. But it has recently come under fire from various strands of argument which hold that what it's rational to believe supervenes not just on the evidence, but also on the moral stakes of the context one is in. So for instance, then the fact that in holding a certain belief, one might stand to harm other innocent people. So towards the end of the book, then, I explicitly address questions about the intersection between moral norms and epistemic norms. I provide some fairly detailed arguments as to why I don't think that approaches such as moral encroachment or doxastic morality are ultimately going to help us resolve the relevant issues, even if we agree, as I think we should, that these are otherwise valuable contributions to contemporary epistemology. So the reason they won't help us solve these problems is because even if we agreed that the moral stakes can help sort of move the threshold for epistemic justification up, that doesn't in any way show that we couldn't be in a position where one's prejudiced beliefs nonetheless can meet that evidential threshold wherever we set it. So I think that's important because in the end, I think the best way forward here in strengthening the position of the victims of prejudice is not by blurring the line between the moral and the epistemic norms, but precisely by holding them at some distance from each other. And I think it's generally misguided to attempt to ground the moral wrongs of prejudice belief, or the moral wrongs that flow from prejudice belief, in the supposed epistemic wrong of holding these beliefs in the first place. Because quite simply, your ability to claim that I have wronged you shouldn't in any way depend on your ability to show that I was in a position to know any better. That's just placing, I think, an extraneous burden on the victim. So the victim's claim to have been wronged should be recognized, in my view, as an objective matter, right? A question of what rights one has to be protected against these kinds of harms. And in no way should this depend on how things might have looked from the perspective of the victimizer. Now, by contrast, that perspective, right, might help settle the question of whether the victimizer is in some sense blameworthy for their actions. But I think there's more to moral responsibility than blame. And I believe there are important forms of moral responsibility that can attach even to blameless wrongdoers. And I think when it comes to the remediation of prejudice, we're really better off focusing on that aspect than to get ourselves entangled in the weeds of epistemology. All right, so I'm going to end there and say thank you very much. And once again, invite you to get in touch with me if you have any questions, comments, and so on.
Andre, thank you so much. Terrific. Giulia, would you begin the period of critics?
All right, so first, thank you so much, Paul. Thanks for inviting me to discuss this book. I really found this book to be a very insightful analysis of prejudice and its epistemic and especially its moral dimensions. And I have to say, when I read the book, I found myself agreeing with a lot of what Andre's saying. So I'm going to be focusing on what's maybe a narrow set of issues, but I hope that they're still helpful to discussing this book today together. So what I want to focus on is this claim that Andre was talking about, that the standard view or the target view of prejudice as an epistemically flawed attitude is mistaken. And what I would like to try to do is put a little bit of pressure on this claim by raising two separate points, which I think that from different directions aim to challenge the idea that Andre's really talking about prejudice, the same topic that proponents of the standard view are talking about. So my first point is a point about the fact that not all negative stereotypes seem to be prejudices. And in the short time that I have available, I'm going to try to motivate the idea that the difference may be a difference in doxastic content, not just affective or cognitive components. And I'm going to try to suggest that this is different. This is based on a different interpretation that we can give for the generic content of stereotypes. My second point is a more general point about the methodology of giving an account of prejudice and what role we should give to what is typically the case with prejudice and irrationality. So for my first point, one of the many insightful points that Andre makes in this book is that prejudices are a stereotype, and as such, they are expressed by what we can take as a generic rather than a universal generalization. And generic generalizations can absorb many instances without being disconfirmed. So birds fly, baby birds don't fly. If I encounter a baby bird that doesn't fly, I'm not going to think that birds don't fly, or this is not going to be taken to disconfirm my stereotype. So Andre argues, as he's just summarized, that the generic form of prejudices plus some background beliefs that we may have can render negative instances irrelevant. So when Solomon goes to university, even though he encounters women who are as intelligent as men, he may not have to take this to establish that his stereotype is false. So what I want to suggest is that not all negative stereotypes seem to be prejudices. And that's because not all interpretations of generic claims seem to be good candidates for prejudice. In particular, I'm going to focus on two generic interpretations that we can give for the generic content of stereotypes, and argue that only on one specific generic interpretation we can take these stereotypes to be prejudices, even though both could be stereotypes. So take again the case of Solomon, just modified a little bit because that's first my point better, but not a lot hinges on this. So take the belief that women are bad at math. Now, this sentence, women are bad at math, can be interpreted in two different ways. The first is what some people call a majority generic. So majority generics express a statistical connection between members of a kind and a property. So in this case, Solomon's belief is a belief that the property of being bad at math is prevalent among members of the kind women. So examples of majority generics are things like cars are radios, barns are red. So these are just generics about statistical distributions properties, and they're straightforwardly disconfirmed by negative instances, even though with the kind of flexibility that Endre talks about. But there's also a second way to interpret this claim, which is what some people call characterizing or characteristic generics. Characterizing generics posit a principled connection between the kind and a property. So women are bad at math in virtue of being women. There is something about women that explains why those women who are bad at math are bad at math. It's part of what it is to be a woman, that a woman is bad at math. Now, typically, these generics also support statistical generalizations. If you think that women are bad at math in virtue of being women, you also expect that most women are going to be bad at math. But this doesn't need to be the case. You could have beliefs about intervening conditions that explain why women do not display the property, even though they were supposed to display the property, because, for instance, feminism and the subversion of traditional gender roles have made women likely to work twice as hard as men, so that they appear to be just as good. But really, women are bad at math. So the two interpretations expressed by women are bad at math really have different truth conditions, and they really seem to be different propositions. Now, these two linguistic expressions also seem to map onto two different modes of representation. This is not just a linguistic issue. These are really two ways of representing kinds and their properties. When Endre claims that prejudices are expressed by generic statements, he seems to focus on mere statistical prevalence. He claims that Solomon, for instance, could take his belief to be true just in virtue of contingent social facts. So this would make it a majority generic. But to me, beliefs about mere statistical distributions don't really seem to be good examples of prejudice. And let me try to argue for this with another short example. So I was watching a debate online about a wealth gap between white and Black Americans, and it was a white supremacist and a progressive guy. Now, they seem to hold the same negative stereotype that Black people are poor, but they also seem to have two very different beliefs. The progressive person has a statistical belief that the property of being poor is prevalent among Black people, while the white supremacist thinks that there is a principal connection between Black people and being poor. So one represents something like most Black people are poor because centuries of oppression and systemic racism have made Black Americans less wealthy than white Americans. And the other person that represent the property as being typical of the kind itself. So it's part of what it is to be a Black person, that a Black person is bad with money or lazy or whatever they think. And this is why they're poor. So it seems to me intuitive to claim that both have the stereotype, but only the second one has a prejudice. And the difference seems to me to be at least in part doxastic. So it's not just the affective or the cognitive component. They really believe different things, and this explains why one is a prejudice and the other one doesn't seem to be a prejudice. And I also think that we may want to allow for negative stereotypes that aren't prejudices, especially when these negative stereotypes are true and when having them is necessary for positive societal change. But if we limit the prejudice to the characterizing mode of generic generalization, then it seems that prejudices have two additional properties. If prejudices are about social properties, which I think they seem to be always false because they posit the essentialist explanation of contingent social facts. And also, the evidence against prejudice will seem to include much more than just evidence of statistical distribution. So the evidential situation of Solomon after going to university may be different than what Endre is claiming, because supposedly upon going to university, Solomon will have learned a lot of facts that make the essentialist explanation likely false. So to summarize my point so far, not all negative stereotypes seem to be prejudices. And one explanation is that while stereotypes can be statistical generic generalization, prejudices seem to be restricted to a more specific generic content, which represents a principal connection between a kind and a property. So now very, very briefly for my second point. In the book, Endre argues that prejudices could be a rational response to the evidence, not that they typically are. So my second point is about this claim. let's go back to Solomon. Let's grant that Endre is right. Solomon is rationally responding to his evidence when he doesn't change his stereotype, prejudice, that women are bad at math. So what does this case tell us? Now, it can tell us that prejudice can be rational, like Endre claims, but it could also tell us, like the proponent of the standard view could also claim that Solomon seemed to be prejudiced, but really we can't tell yet because he hasn't yet encountered evidence that this confirmed his belief. Now, of course, this case is not the only thing that Endre uses to argue for this claim, but you know, I just want to focus on the methodology generally, and focusing on this example is a way to do that. So, of course, if it turned out that none of the pragmatic cases of prejudice that the standard view took to be cases of prejudice were actually cases of prejudice after all, because people are typically like Solomon, then we may want to conclude that prejudice does not require irrationality. But I think that similarly, if it turned out that almost none of the people we take to be prejudiced are in the evidential situation of Solomon, then this could show us that maybe Endre is not focusing on the right phenomenon. And I think that at least in part then, what we take the case of Solomon to show depends on what we think is typically the case. So I agree that it may be hard to know whether people are reasoning like Solomon because we're not typically aware of people's priors and background beliefs. I also think that there is some evidence that shows or could potentially show that people are not typically like Solomon, and they may be actually prejudices or stereotypes may be hard for people to revise in a way that is more difficult than any other belief that people have, or many other beliefs that people have. So there's something specific about stereotypes that makes them resilient to this confirmation. And one phenomenon that I'm thinking about is the phenomenon of subtyping, where people cluster together negative instances that's atypical, but they do so on the basis of properties that they did not initially think established that members of the group were atypical. So it doesn't seem to be a kind of Bayesian updating. So my point is this: we have a concept of stereotypes, we have a concept of negative stereotypes. Now, if there is a phenomenon of people systematically holding on to their stereotype beliefs, then we may think that our account of prejudice should be targeting that phenomenon. And it may turn out that fewer people are prejudiced than we initially thought, even cases that we took to be paradigmatic. But in any case, it seems to me that whether people are typically like Solomon, rationally resisting revising their prejudice, matters to deciding what we would want an account of prejudice to be an account of. So these has been my 2 points. Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Yeah, that was really wonderful to think through. Endre, fascinated to hear your response.
All right, yeah, thank you, Giulia. That's really great. So I want to start with this point about generic. So Giulia is pressing me on the question of what particular sort of generic that I might have had in mind when I wrote the book. And she offers sort of 2 possible candidates. On the one hand, majority generics, and on the other hand, characterizing generics. Then she raises questions about whether both of these are, as it were, equally fit to serve in an account of a prejudice belief. So I feel like, first of all, I should probably make a little bit of a confession here. I fully admit that the book is insufficiently clear on many of these issues. And in fact, I've sort of gone back and forth with myself a few times about just how much I ought to be leaning on this idea of prejudice as generic judgment notion. So maybe a bit of background will help. So when I first started writing about these things about 10 years ago, I was sort of looking around for a good telling kind of example of a familiar, commonplace sort of judgment that would display a sort of reasonable resilience in the light of counter evidence. And by way of teaching, I'd been reading Sarah Jane Leslie's work on generics, and it struck me quite right away as a very nice example of the sort of thing that I had in mind, but also plausibly, providing an independently plausible template for how one might think about the acquisition and maintenance of prejudice belief specifically. And I note that Leslie herself has sort of come around to that kind of thinking as well, it seems. So in her 2016 Stanford Encyclopedia article, she has a full section on analyzing stereotyping and prejudice in terms of generics and so on. But then when time came around to writing the book, I sort of realized that this literature on generics has blossomed enormously. Not only has it blossomed, but it's also seemed to be pulling in very different directions at once, right? So you have On the one hand, people whose primary interest in generics is coming from the linguistics side. So they're going to be looking mostly at the linguistic form of generics. Then you have people from psychology who are going to be looking at the underlying psychological mechanisms and the early acquisition of generic knowledge and so forth. So my interest was primarily here in the psychology of it, and I do, of course, recognize that linguistic evidence is often relevant to understanding the underlying psychological mechanisms. But I do suspect, having read some of this literature, that some part of this very bewildering variety of kinds of generics that are now documented in the literature is really mostly a linguistic phenomenon, doesn't map on to relevant differences in underlying psychological structure. So that's a roundabout way of getting back to the, so what about majority and characterizing generics? What did I have in mind here? So certainly I was thinking about these generics as bearing some kind of explanatory relevance, right? So in other words, not simply majority of generics, that's going to be clear. On the other hand, it also seemed to me that it wouldn't be much of a prejudice if it didn't encode some ideas about the relative prevalence of the property in question in the target population. So even if these aren't, as it were, ideas couched in very precise statistical terms. So I guess I would have to say, right, that I had in mind something that sort of cuts across the distinction between majority generics and characterizing generics, and sort of incorporates elements of both of these. So that might seem like a bit of a non-answer, but I do in fact suspect that there's an actually substantive issue laying underneath there, and that comes from sort of Giulia's point about essentialization. So unlike a number of other people who are writing in this area, I suspect, I guess I think there can be genuine explanatory relevance even in generic generalizations that range over various kinds of contingent, gerrymandered social kinds. So in other words, I strongly resist the idea that generics work only by imparting some kind of like essentialization onto its subjects. So I think that even in a case where we full well know that we're talking about a group of subjects who should really share no deep underlying nature, but who for random reasons just happen to find themselves in similar social situations, there can be certain things that are true to say of them as a kind. There can be important explanatory relations between the kind membership and properties that we assume to be had by the individuals and so on. So I'm thinking of examples like, immigrants are hardworking. I take immigrants to be a group of people that are, social category with no deep underlying shared nature and so on. Certain things can nonetheless be true to say of them. And in fact, I sort of find it surprising that there seems to be so much resistance to this idea in a literature that is otherwise so open to the notion, right, that accidents of our social situation can have a profound impact on how we think and how we act, can shape our character in deep and important ways. Subtyping. So this is a new name, at least to me, for a phenomenon that nonetheless sort of feels broadly familiar. I would certainly agree that subtyping can be and sort of an epistemically bad strategy, sort of an evasive strategy for avoiding contrary evidence. But I don't feel like it could be all bad all of the time. In fact, it seems to me that sometimes subtyping just has to be the right response. So it's an expression of learning in some sense, right? And so you adjust the precise boundaries of your target population, the target population that you're generalizing over as you learn more about the phenomenon in question. So I completely agree that subtyping is a plausible mechanism by which people sometimes attempt to retain their generalizations in the face of contrary evidence, but I don't think that all instances of subtyping are going to be bad in this way. I doubt, moreover, that we can come up with anything like a hard and fast criterion for trying to distinguish the good cases from the bad cases. So the whole thing sort of reminds me a little bit about what's called the reference class problem, I believe, in statistics, right? So the reference class problem arises because every individual belongs to multiple cross-cutting classifications. Can sometimes be essentially impossible, or at least really, really hard to determine which particular classification is the most relevantly explanatory or predictive with respect to a certain property. So an example that I like to use is something like, immigrants are overrepresented in crime statistics, right? So that is true in many polities at some level of abstraction at least. But it will turn out nonetheless to have nothing really to do with immigrant status per se, right? So rather, what's going on here is that immigrant populations tend to be, on the whole, younger, like poorer, less educated, living in urban areas and so on. And these are all factors that we know correlate with crime. So we can all presumably then agree that immigrant, non-immigrant is not the most relevant classification. But we might not also be able to tell which of these other classifications is the right one, or even if there is a right one to deploy for the purposes of generalization and explanation. So nonetheless, right, we're expected in some sense to continue redrawing the boundaries of our generalizations as we learn more about the phenomenon. All right, so that's what I have. Thanks, Giulia.
Wonderful. All right, next, Renée, please.
Thanks so much. I opted to go without slides, so we'll just head into it. Hopefully it'll be quite clear. This book is incredibly rich, and I'm actually sympathetic to much of what Endre says. Particularly, I'm sympathetic to his focus on non-ideal epistemology and his commitment to outlining normative epistemology for subjects with our actual cognitive limits. And there's so much that we could talk about from this book. But I'm just going to focus on questions that come up in chapter 7, which is where he turns to considering the social explanations for the persistence of prejudice. And he correctly, to my mind, points out that the texture of our social interactions depends on a rich tapestry of assumptions that we make about each other. Assumptions about what you'll be interested in, what you'll value, how you'll act in a context, what your role dictates you or prohibits you to do. This whole web of beliefs, behaviors, and norms is what coordinates our expectations and shapes our interactions. So he notes that stereotypes don't merely serve as anchoring points in people's cognition, they also provide us with scripts that help to coordinate our social interactions. So far, so good. But then he suggests that the connection between social scripts, social norms, and stereotypes can explain how stereotypes persist by explaining how it is practically rational to act as if you believed it, even when you don't. So even when your credence in the relevant proposition is below whatever's going to count as in the range of belief on Begby's picture. He says, if stereotypes provide social scripts, there will typically be an incentive associated with complying with stereotypes in one's outward behavior, even when one doesn't actually endorse them. As such, they can continue to hold sway over our interpersonal transactions long after the individuals who take part in these transactions are cognitively ready to move on. These scripts have the force of norms. For me, this raises two big questions. The first is, what does it mean to comply with stereotypes in one's outward behavior? Are we meant to think of the stereotyped person fulfilling a negatively valenced social expectation for her type? Or are we thinking of an outgroup member? And if so, I need some help filling in. What is the outgroup member doing that constitutes complying with the stereotype in their outward behavior? And the second question, which is a little bit bigger, is what sort of incentives does Begby have in mind here? So some of the comments in this section, many throughout this chapter, are suggesting that what he has in mind are social sanctions, so particularly penalties for norm violation. But not every norm that coordinates our behavior is actually enforced by social sanctions, even lightweight ones like barely expressed disapproval. Only the social practices that we normatively expect others to comply with and which we are invested in get that treatment. The second order stability, where a norm that each member individually disapproves of persists because each individual anticipates high costs were they to violate it, can arise either when there's some cost to individuals for failing to penalize others' violations, so they've got a higher order motivation to sanction violations of the norm that they do not endorse, or when the unilateral cost of coordination that it facilitates, when the unilateral cost of losing that coordination is prohibitively costly. Examples of that second kind are really plentiful. For example, we might have originally arranged our economic labor markets in ways that favor men because we at the time endorsed prejudiced beliefs. But well after we've reached gender enlightenment, if there are still material differences, like asymmetries in the parental leaves available or in work hours expectations, or even remainder gender pay gaps, those constraints are coordination costs rather than penalties that still make it practically rational for enlightened couples to nevertheless choose a stereotypical gender division of labor. But that has nothing to do with norm enforcement, and it wouldn't discourage people from voicing skepticism about the grounding of the prejudiced gender beliefs. In fact, I actually think the example that he uses in this chapter about electability is one of these cases, rather than a case in which we are responsive to anticipated penalties for violating a norm. So our anxiety about whether a given candidate is electable voices our doubts about whether, were we to shift our behavior and vote for a non-traditional candidate, enough others in our party would do so as well for us to still successfully coordinate rather than splitting our vote and losing the election. It's not about being penalized. It's about whether we trust the others to also coordinate. So the difference between the stability achieved by fear of penalty and these other forms of stability shows up most starkly in what it takes to finally replace the practice. If a practice was sustained by threat of penalty, that same threat may, as Begby notes, keep people from openly questioning whether it should be continued. But this kind of unpopular norm is really brittle. If the information about its unpopularity ever gets out, often that results in sudden abandonment because then nobody has a reason to keep following it. But the other kind is much harder to dislodge. Even if everyone knows that everyone disprefers this practice, to switch, we would need to actively coordinate our behavior around jointly doing something else. We need more than information. We need to pick a specific alternative and trust others to switch to it at the same time. Asking critical probing questions about the underlying rationale for a current practice of this kind won't budge it. Now, how much this matters just depends on what the aim of the chapter is. If it was to establish that social structuring effects of prejudice sometimes persist because, despite privately disavowing a prejudiced belief, we nevertheless rationally expect others, who unbeknownst to us also disavow it, to penalize us for not behaving as if, well, then I'd like to see some other examples and hear more about the specific behaviors, practices, and penalties that you have in mind. But I think the threat of penalty is only essential to the story if you aim to establish that even in a society where every single member has cognitively moved on, stereotypes will remain stable as a cultural form because no one is willing to question them. Fear of criticizing a norm does depend on the expectation of being penalized, whereas mere stability of a form past its usefulness does not. So if the goal instead was to emphasize that it takes so much more to fix a prejudiced society than just supplying individual believers with better evidence, then I wholeheartedly agree. And I also think the story should go further. It's laudable to attend to the role of social practice in maintaining cultural forms beyond their utility and beyond our individual commitments. But the discussion elides the affective role in the persistence of prejudice and the continuation of the norms that we no longer endorse. And I think that we should pay attention to that affective role. There also might have been another kind of goal, to explain how it is epistemically rational for people like Witt to rationally adopt culturally normal beliefs, so to come to acquire these beliefs. And if so, then the assumption that people will be penalized for breaking the relevant social script isn't important at all. All we need is that behavioral forms persist despite the absence of individual commitment. Here, the story is that Witt is a person who merely observes others going about their everyday business, reasonably infers that they hold certain beliefs, reckons that if they all believe it, then there's a good chance that it's true, and thereby concludes that he should believe the same himself. And so then he adopts a belief that actually nobody he's observing endorses. This raises my third question, which is about the rationality of Witt's belief here. Why should we think that inference to an explanation of others' behavior, especially of their omissive behavior, so the absence of, say, integrated classrooms or the paucity of women in political leadership positions, provides a rational basis for forming a specific belief, like it is better to preserve segregation or women are worse at leadership? So what Begby says here is that socially accepted patterns of action and interaction can provide individuals with something like a non-overt form of testimony, even in the absence of explicit assertion. But overt testimony clearly identifies the proposition for which one is receiving evidence. Observations of others' behavior is not only not overt, it radically underdetermines what beliefs might motivate it. And I'm not sure that interpretive charity should extend so far as to credit inferences like Witt's with being rationally justified. So to make this more concrete, let's focus on an illustration that he offers. It's presently a culturally normal belief that MSG is bad for you. This was trumpeted by testimony when I was a child, but has since been scientifically discredited. So he writes, one cannot not respond to the widespread MSG scare and the no MSG signs in Asian restaurants as evidence, as grounds for some inference or other. But if it is evidence, what is it evidence for? Which inference is warranted? Presumably that MSG is bad for you. That's end quote. I'm actually not so sure that that's the inference we should be drawing. So in a Bayesian sense, and on a belief as credence view, it is true that I cannot not respond to any fact as evidence for some proposition. but I can quickly irrationally overreach my support or misidentify the proposition. Along with signs announcing the absence of MSG, I also frequently encounter signs and labels exclaiming gluten-free, not from concentrate, ever, and contains nuts. It seems to me that someone who concluded from these labels that gluten, concentrate, and nuts are probably bad for you would be irrational. At most, what these labels give them evidence for is just that some consumer behavior is responsive to the presence of that ingredient. So as I wrap up here, I just want to raise one last issue. Here and elsewhere, Begby says that we must respond to information as evidence, not merely descriptively, but normatively. It's an epistemic error to disregard evidence. And even when its justificatory force is marginal or significance ambiguous. I have misgivings about placing this much weight on this, especially in the context of non-ideal epistemology. As limited agents, we have limited attention and cognitive power. We must disregard some evidence. I mean, honestly, we probably disregard the vast majority of the evidence that we encounter. And that's why Sherlock Holmes tales are so fascinating, because there's a fictional person who doesn't. But as agents who are really bad at updating, especially on weak evidence, it seems like a rational rule of thumb to ignore information when we aren't in a position to determine whether it bears on our inquiry or what it would support. Ignoring evidence of this kind seems to me clearly the lesser evil, when the other danger is that we might update on it in a way that distorts our overall epistemic state space, a fact that Andre's book eloquently illustrates how hard it can be to recover from once our beliefs are shaped by misleading or misunderstood evidence.
Renée, thank you. Yeah, so Andre, your book is intensely practical, so it's no surprise at all that Renée is raising intensely practical questions for you to answer. So I'm really looking forward to your response, please.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks, Renée. This is really cool. So I got to say, I was very, very excited when I first heard that you were interested in saying something about Chapter 7, because it raises issues that I find very deep and interesting, and that also sort of fall outside of the mainstream of much contemporary epistemology. It's also a bit terrifying, as it were, because it's also clearly the least developed and most exploratory chapter of the book. And so when you ask sort of, well, what is the aim of this chapter? Is it this or that? It's like, maybe I was a bit unclear, and maybe sort of the tone of my reasoning would change as I went on through the chapter. So these are all possibilities. So I'm going to say right away, lots of the questions you raise here are excellent. I'm not going to have any quick answers to them. These are things that I'm going to sort of stick at the back of my mind and mull over for quite some time to come. But for background, so one of the main contributions of the book, as I see it, is sort of to widen the evidence base that we're considering when we're talking about phenomena like prejudice belief. So not just as for the standard individually acquired inductive evidence, but also say, testimony. But then in Chapter 7, I try to push even a little bit further and to say, like, couldn't we also sort of draw inferences, not just from what people tell us explicitly, but also how they act in context, right? So my idea was something like this, and it's an idea that I find overwhelmingly plausible on its own terms, namely that social learning doesn't just occur by explicit instruction. It can also take place by, for instance, observing like how we do things around here and so on. So I was interested in seeing how this mode of learning might be incorporated into the epistemology of prejudice. So for instance, when a child observes sort of gendered or racialized patterns of social interaction, right, in their society, they can plausibly infer that there are unspoken rules in place there. They can plausibly infer something about the states of mind of the agents who are interacting in this particular way, and then they can draw certain kinds of conclusions from that. So my thought then was, we can come to think about these patterns of social interactions, providing something like a non-overt form of testimony. Maybe that's kind of like an awkward, I think I got that from Susanna Siegel's book, which I was working through at the time. But anyway, so something like a non-overt form of testimony by which then children can come to learn, for good or ill, right, certain facts about their social world. And I think this might be particularly relevant in many of our contemporary settings, where on the one hand, we have this express taboo, right, on actually saying racist things, but nonetheless, our uneasiness continues to shine through in our behavior. Right? So Renée is now throwing a bit of cold water on this hope that we can sort of just smoothly put this in there in service of this kind of reasoning. And in particular, she argues, I'm going to let's start with this like later point that you were making, that we, while testimony in familiar forms provides support for particular highly specific propositions, these kinds of social behaviors severely underdetermine what propositions they would be relevant to. So we can ask, like, what would then justify someone like wit in forming this specific belief on the basis of observations of this specific sort of behavior? And I certainly see the merit of that question, right? But in the end, I kind of want to push back a little bit and say, maybe this sort of very sharp distinction between the specificity of assertion, let's say, and the vagueness of nonverbal behaviors can be overstated a bit. So I don't want to go too far afield here, but I tend to think, for instance, that testimonial force can attach to implicature and presupposition as easily as that can to the asserted content. Moreover, I broadly tend to favor, relevance theoretic ideas that even which proposition is asserted in a particular utterance is typically underdetermined by the linguistically encoded content of that utterance. So I acknowledge, of course, that these are minority positions in philosophy. So then I nonetheless think that there's something here to harness and as something like an answer to Renée's question, or at least something to work with here, right? That maybe then it's not such a big problem, right? Because I think a pattern of behavior can provide support to a number of different propositions at once, including perhaps the one that wit takes to be relevant to. So if we ask what would justify him in focusing on this proposition in particular, we might be able to tell a story about how this particular proposition, for one reason or another, just happens to have high salience in the environment at the time. And I think, in fact, that somehow has to be how we should think about the difference between, say, reading no MSG as suggesting that MSG is bad for everyone, and reading contains no nuts in no such way at all. So again, it has to do with background knowledge and about relative salience of different propositions, without denying the fact that you're pointing to that there are simultaneously a number of different propositions in place. So you could, of course, think that it supports all of these at the same time. So I wanted to say one or two things also about Renée's first suggestion. So the context here is my speculation that because of the way that stereotype encoding social scripts tend to govern our social interactions, then we might theoretically at least find ourselves in situations where we collectively behave as if we endorsed these stereotypes, even if individually we don't endorse these stereotypes. And I speculated that one reason why this might happen is that there are incentives and disincentives in place here. So the penalty for violating scripts or even publicly questioning their validity need not be particularly harsh in order for them nonetheless to be fairly effective, right? So they might get you branded as difficult or awkward or something like that. And for lots of people, that's going to be plenty enough to keep them in place. So I take it that Renée is sort of suggesting that one way to think about this, we can in fact think about some of these examples in even leaner terms than what I have in mind, right? Maybe penalties are not even needed. Maybe we could see forms of problematic collective behavior persisting simply as of on its own inertia because of the coordination costs that are involved in working out alternative arrangements. And I think that's a really cool idea. I think it's sort of broadly compatible with the outlook that I take in the book. I'm going to have to think more about it, but I want to emphasize then that, I don't think it's merely penalties, right? The negative incentives that are involved in propping up the problematic social scripts as well. So I also emphasized it could be, genuine positive rewards, right? So for instance, the rewards one reaps from taking part in the social interactions that the scripts help facilitate. So sometimes you can prefer sticking to a somewhat unfavorable social script to attempting to negotiate a new script, right? Because the existing script is at least predictable, right? Whereas I might not much trust my ability to negotiate for a more favorable script given the background power differentials between me and the other agents that are involved here. So thanks again, though. Those are really cool comments, and I'm gonna keep thinking of them. Bye-bye.
This brings us to our last critic. Tom Kelly, please take it away.
Okay, so I thought Andre's book was terrific. Really enjoyed reading it, working through it. I think Renée used the word rich to describe it. I definitely echo and second that. Just a few of the many discussions I found illuminating. I found very illuminating the discussion of so-called algorithmic bias in the criminal justice system in chapter 8. I did like the discussion of many prejudice beliefs as generic generalizations as opposed to something more like universal generalizations, and the epistemological consequences of this, how that plays out. This discussion of evidential preemption that I quite found very interesting, and maybe plan to write something about myself. This is where certain speech acts seem to inoculate themselves against later disconfirmation kind of in advance. So, and that's not a complete list. I found there's lots of things very interesting and rich discussions and so on. Okay, but being a critic, I'm supposed to kind of criticize something. So I want to press a bit on the main thesis, which I take it as something like this: paradigmatically prejudiced beliefs, like women are less adept at math than men. That's kind of his core example that he uses throughout the text. That those kinds of prejudiced beliefs might be fully rational, and the believers who hold them might be fully rational. There might not be any, as he puts it, breakdown in epistemic rationality. And so I take it there's kind of two different ways one might, so-called, for sure, prejudiced beliefs might be rational, can be rational, need not be irrational. I take it there's two different ways one could try to put pressure on this. First, one could argue, somebody could deny and argue that, look, it could never be rational or in any realistic circumstances for a believer to rationally acquire, and then rationally maintain the belief that women are less adept at math, right? And say, no, that just couldn't happen, or wouldn't happen any close possible world or anything like that. And that's kind of the kind of challenge that Endre really focuses on in the book, trying to show, no, that really could happen, and even in using kind of realistic kinds of reasoning and so on that we ourselves might engage in certain contexts. And I was convinced by that. I think it makes a convincing case. But there's different kind of challenge one might raise, and this is the one I want to push a bit, to the thesis that prejudiced beliefs, these paradigmatically prejudiced beliefs need not be irrational. Namely that when you really tell the story in the right way, such that, okay, we're ready to agree with Endre that these are rational, the case for calling them prejudiced is pretty weak at that point. That so that'd be another way it could turn out to be that prejudiced beliefs can't be irrational, is when you tell the story the right way to make them rational, we kind of lose the thought that the feeling that they're prejudiced, or there's not any good sense in which they're prejudiced. So I'm trying to push on that a bit. I think that it makes sense for him to concentrate on the first possibility, given that's where likely resistance and opposition is going to come from. But I want to press in this other direction. There'll be some points of contact with some of the things Giulia said, I think, about what exactly is meant by prejudice, although I maybe put a different spin on it. So first, let me just put on the table a notion of prejudice I think is relatively familiar, although it's not the one Andre's working with in the book for purposes of contrast. And this is a notion that kind of takes the etymology, what I take to be the etymology of the word, quite seriously, prejudice in the sense of prejudgment, right? I'm thinking Smith is a bad guy even before I have any evidence what kind of person he is, right? Then I'm kind of prejudiced against Smith, right? On the other hand, of that same judgment, if there's all this evidence around that I get that Smith really is a bad guy, and it's sufficient to justify this belief, then if I take the belief Smith's a bad guy, it's not a prejudice against Smith, it's just this well-justified belief, right? So somebody might have a reaction. Of course, you can do the same thing with respect to groups and so on, as opposed to individual people. Somebody might have the reaction that, I notice this notion of prejudice, I think, is not maybe that far. Endre started the session today by talking about Fricker's notion of prejudice. And I think I tried to copy it down, but Fricker says, prejudice as a judgment, quote, as a judgment made or maintained without proper regard to the evidence, right? So that's not so far from this idea of, prejudging, making the judgment before you've got the adequate evidence that would suffice to justify it if you had that kind of evidence. So take that notion of prejudice. Then you might say, look, a lot of these examples he gives us in the book are cases, a case where somebody has, given how we're describing the epistemic situation of this person, they've been epistemically justified a rational belief that women are less adept at math, but it's not a prejudice if they waited for the evidence to come in the right way and formed the judgment. So I take it that notion of prejudice is not his notion of prejudice. His notion of prejudice, let's see, I should have it here. Sorry. So for Endre, a prejudice is, quote, this is from pages 8 and 9, a negatively charged stereotype targeting some group of people and derivatively the individuals who comprise this group, right? So as I understand his notion of a prejudiced belief, and I'm sure he'll correct me if I'm getting this wrong, a prejudiced belief is simply a belief that has as its content the relevant kind of negatively charged stereotype, right? So as soon as you got the belief that women are less adept at math than men, then you've got a prejudiced belief. So notice the way he's thinking about it is this notion of prejudiced belief, the primary thing that's prejudiced, it's kind of beliefs as belief types, right? Beliefs with certain contents, and any belief that has a certain content, kind of whether a belief's prejudiced or not, supervenes on its content, and there won't be token beliefs with the same content, one of which is prejudiced and one of which is not prejudiced, right? And given that understanding of prejudiced belief, which I think is different from, for example, the one Fricker has based on that quote and this intuitive notion I was outlining a second ago, maybe it's a little bit less surprising. It's not trivial, but it's a little less surprising that you're going to have prejudiced beliefs coming out as, in some cases, epistemically rational, in some cases, epistemically irrational, simply because this is a familiar phenomenon that beliefs with the same contents the tokens might differ depending on how the different individuals who hold them, how they're embedded in the world and so on, right? It's not completely trivial because we might think there are some beliefs which, given their contents, could never be rationally believed, right? So maybe the belief that 1 + 1 = 10, right? There's no background story you could tell about the misleading evidence the person has. Just the content itself would preclude that belief from ever being justified, right? So even if the oracle that's always been right in the past, and whenever you disagree with the oracle, you end up being wrong. When the oracle outputs 1 + 1 = 10, no, you're still not justified in believing it, right? So somebody might think, right, these kind of generic generalizations, women are less adept at math than men. That's just like 1 + 1 = 10. You could never tell a story that you could be justified in believing it. That doesn't seem so plausible, right? So I think it's kind of easier to get to the conclusion when you're thinking about prejudice this way. But it's not to say that's trivial or anything like that. So you might think, look, I think if you use prejudice in the way Andre's using it, and I don't claim this is an idiosyncratic usage, even among philosophers, among psychologists, but I think if you use it that way, then you can vindicate the thesis that prejudiced beliefs can be epistemically rational. But I do want to press a little bit. You might say, at this point, it's just terminology. Given this one notion of prejudice that I outlined before, maybe Fricker's notion, it'll go one way. Given the notion he's using in the book, it'll go another way. His thesis is vindicated. But I do want to press a little bit on the notion he's using and how well this really carves the phenomena that we're interested in at the joints, right? So that's what I'll try to do my final few minutes here. So here's, let's talk about this proposition. The proposition that, again, understood as a generic generalization as opposed to something more like a universal generalization, that men are more violent than women, right? Okay. And let's imagine a possible world in which it's true that men are more violent than women. Maybe you think this is such a possible world, but we'll just bracket that. Here's a possible world. It's true that men are more violent than women. And in fact, there's lots of evidence this is true, right? And it's kind of abundant evidence, and it's drawn from different times and places and so on. And the evidence is such that people who are familiar with it, even people who would like to be egalitarians and so on, really do the uniquely rational thing for them to think, people who are fully acquainted with the evidence, that it's true that men are more violent than women. And in fact, some people know this, right? They satisfy whatever conditions are required for having knowledge, right? So let's think about different cases here. You've got case A, where the person, on the basis of the compelling evidence, believes that men are more violent than women and knows this, right? Then contrast that with case B, where somebody has lots of anti-male animus and without evidence will believe the worst about men and so on. So without looking at this evidence, they take up the same belief, right, that men are more violent than women. So already I'm thinking the way he's thinking about it, both of these cases are prejudice because they've got the same, they're both prejudice beliefs because they've got the same content, and it's a negatively charged stereotype about a particular group. That already pinches for me that we're going to put these people together in the context. You can think about a third person who also has a view about the relative, how violent men are compared to women and so on. They're in the same possible world. Well, there's all this evidence around that men are more violent than women. They don't believe that. because they've got an anti-female animus, they wouldn't believe that there's any respect in which men are worse than women, right? So because of that, they kind of don't pay attention to this evidence and form the belief that men and women are no more or less violent, right? There's no difference with respect to violence with respect to gender. That person, I take it, on the view of prejudice in question, counts as unprejudiced about the issue because they don't believe anything which has a the actual content of their beliefs doesn't involve a negatively valenced stereotype about some group. So to me, I worry about, on this understanding of prejudice, if I'm getting it right, that we're lumping the first two people as prejudiced. That already pinches. And then the third person won't be prejudiced because they lack a belief with the right kind of content. So that's just to put some pressure on this notion of prejudice. And then there's this question of how it would map on with Fricker. Notice at least the quote that, based on the quote that he gave us about Fricker, it seems like she is thinking about prejudice as something that attaches to token judgments, which is the way I was thinking about it, as opposed to I think he's thinking about it, where as soon as you've got the right content, then it's either going to be a case of prejudice or not prejudice, irrespective of other things that can vary in different tokenings of the same belief with that content. So anyway, I'll stop there. Just be interested to hear what he has to say about that.
Tom, great. Great comments. As we all know in philosophy, some disagreements persist because we're using terms differently. And even once we get clear on the terms, there is this question about which characterizations are most suitable to the phenomena. So these are great questions. Andre, please respond.
Yeah, thanks so much, Tom. I'm really glad you can make it, and sorry for the sorry for the confusion and the drama. So Tom puts his finger on some really thorny issues about terminology and about how best to systematize various uses of terms as they occur as technical terms in scholarly debates here, as they occur as everyday terms in mundane debates over there, and so on. And I think that the lead question here is whether there is something to be gained by retaining the word prejudice for the actually irrational beliefs, right? And certainly that possibility had occurred to me when I wrote the book. So my initial response when I thought about it was to say that, well, in that case, what we have is essentially just a verbal disagreement, right? It's just not clear anymore that there's any room here for substantive arguments, or any need, I should say, for substantive arguments. In particular, if you take this route, there's just no sense in arguing, right, anymore that prejudice beliefs are intrinsically irrational, since it would just follow from the definitions. So in the book, then, I sort of satisfied myself that, well, this might be a perfectly fine terminological choice in the sense that it's probably consistent with many patterns of use that we can observe in society at large. But I couldn't make sense of it, right, in the context of philosophical discourse, where people are quite clearly trumpeting their views about the rationality of prejudice belief or irrationality of prejudice belief as a discovery, as a substantive insight, as something that's settled by argument and so forth, not simply as a matter of stipulation. But Tom's comments now then lead me to wonder whether I have missed some philosophical subtlety here, and it may be that I have, right? So in the book, I sort of start from this working definition of prejudice as a negative stereotype. I purposely avoid baking into that definition stipulation that they also be false. So in light of this, Tom asks us to consider, some contrasting cases. So first, let's assume the generalization men are more violent than women is true, but not only true, it's also supported by solid converging evidence. So consider two people, A and B. I'm going to sort of leave out C because got a little confused now. What I would say of C is that they are epistemically irrational, but not prejudiced. I guess that's my quick answer. But let's focus on A and B, right? So A believes that women are more violent than men, having studied the statistical and sociological evidence in some detail. B believes that men are more violent than women, having done no such thing, just because of anti-male animus. And then Tom asks simply, look, is it really appropriate to say that these people are both prejudiced, let alone that they're prejudiced to the same extent or whatever, right? Because that certainly seems to follow, right? If we simply define prejudice at the level of belief types, rather than at the level of belief tokens. We're supposed to then think about the belief that these two people share rather than the particular instances that each has. Should we think about prejudice as attaching to the type, the shared type, rather than the individual instances? And I agree that there's something of a pinch, I think Tom said, that's how it feels like there's something not quite right about this. So in the book, right, I talk about extensional and intentional characterizations of prejudice. And I sort of point out that in various parts of the literature, you're going to find people leaning one way now the other. So extensional characterizations of prejudice would essentially be like a list of belief types, right? So that's going to be the paradigmatic kinds of a prejudice belief that we talk about. But then the intentional characterizations of prejudice, right, are going to operate at the token level, as I understand them, right? They would typically then identify prejudice beliefs in terms of characteristic processing errors. We find both of these things, right, in Fricker when she says a judgment made or maintained, so on. So a large part of the book then is expressing the view, right, that despite or contrary to widespread philosophical convictions, there just may be no way to perfectly align the extensional and the intentional characterizations, simply because it may not be the case that all tokens of these belief types are accompanied by or arrived at by these kinds of epistemic errors. So in the end, then I sort of decided to retain prejudice as a type level term. And I think what Tom is pointing out to me is essentially just sort of the price I'm paying, the awkwardness that I then experience for retaining the terminology, trying to pay too much respects to the various patterns of use as they occur in different contexts. So maybe it's too much to think that one can systematize all of these diverging patterns, and there's just no way of rendering them consistent with all the considerations that we see there. So substantively, though, I think Tom and I agree very much that it's a very bad idea to attempt to assess the epistemic standing of belief at the level of belief types, whether it be, as I say in the book, whether it be in terms of form or content or whatever it is. And in fact, I think that's an excellent way of describing a larger motivation for the book in the first place. To assess epistemic standing, we need to move to the level of belief tokens. And here, we can't simply hope to accomplish this by asking, like, what evidence is there regarding a certain proposition, and conclude that this belief lacks propositional justification, let's say, right? So propositional justification, I take, is an inherently belief type level kind of notion. Instead, we need to ask, what evidence would this subject be in a position to rationally avail themselves of? And here, in my view, is where we're going to get those telling dislocations between the extensional characterizations of prejudice, like as a list of belief types, and the intentional token level definitions of prejudice. So then we can ask, well, what if then we decided to go the other way, try to resolve these tensions by moving in the opposite direction and reserve the term prejudice for the irrational instances of negative stereotypes? Sure, that might be fine, but then it seems to me like the argumentative focus of the whole debate would have to change as well, right? As I said above, there's now no longer going to be any need to go on arguing, offering examples, right, supporting the view that prejudice beliefs are intrinsically irrational. That's just going to come for free as a matter of unpacking the definitions. So instead, I then imagine a whole new different set of questions might come to the fore, and they're good questions in some ways, right? So then we would ask, like, is there something distinctive about the kind of irrationality that's on display in prejudice belief? Now, that's actually a question I've given some thought to. And maybe I should give more thought to as well. And my first inclination would be to say, no, once again, I'm not sure there is a distinctive kind of irrationality on display here, right? So 2 dimensions, right? I'm not sure there's a distinctive kind of irrationality on display in the sense that I don't think there is a form of irrationality that all even irrational prejudices share. But also in the sort of outward looking dimension, I'm not sure that this, even if you focus on the prototypical cases of prejudiced irrationality, I'm not sure that this form of irrationality would be unique to prejudice at all. My hunch is that we can find it operating in a host of different domains as well, including political discourse. So that's something I'm hoping to take up in future work. But thanks, appreciate the comments.
So at this point, we've got a little bit of time left, and this would be a chance for critics to follow up on anything, though we'll keep it brief, and for Endre to respond or at least take some notes about how people are thinking about his responses to the criticisms. And then if we have some time afterwards, if people who are joining us as audience members have any reactions, but we will try and wrap up in 15 minutes. So Renée, Giulia, Tom, would you like to follow up on anything in particular?
Sure, I can start. This connects to this discussion of Tom's comments, so I'm just gonna pick it up from there. So I would like to hear maybe a little bit more about this claim that you make, that because it seems that now what you're saying is something like, if it turned out that empirically, typically people are irrational in a special way, then that would be reason to go for something like Fricker's definition of prejudice, or a definition where it's a belief token of irrationality, right? So then, but I guess my question is, what do you think the role is for what is typical of prejudice, and why do you think that it's enough to show that it could be the case that one is rational to say that we're focusing on the right thing? Does it make sense?
Yeah, I think that does make sense. So, I mean, what the book does, right, is to try to shift the argumentative burden here onto anyone who wants to say of some broad class of beliefs held by many different people in many different situations, that there is always or typically some kind of irrationality that accompanies it. So I'm trying to argue that generalizing across these many contexts of learning, these many situations that people find themselves in, is probably a bad idea. I'm also worried, as it were, about philosophers' ability to make these kinds of determinations, right? So I think that you would have to study particular people in particular contexts. You would need an account of the underlying psychological mechanisms and so on. And I think the standard methodologies and examples of philosophers are just poorly suited to make those kinds of determinations, right? We can help map out the conceptual landscape, the various epistemic possibilities that there are and so on. But I don't think we're in a particular position to determine whether people are typically, generally, often, sometimes, never, prejudiced in this sort of way. So when I then look at some of the psychological literature, they will certainly, suggest that people are often irrational in these sorts of ways. But then also, when I consider most working psychologists' conceptions of what epistemic rationality is, then I also don't take really much stock in that, right? Because they seem to have very different views about this. So lots of behaviors that you and I would think about as paradigmatically perfectly fine turn out to be irrational on the psychological discourse, right? So all of these things need to be handled very difficult. So I guess, some of it is about the division of labor between empirical psychology and philosophy. So even I think the sort of more, naturalistic, non-ideal epistemology should recognize its limits on this point. And in general, I just prefer to I guess try to outline how I see the landscape being laid out and what I see the relevant possibilities being, and try to refrain from then speculating about how in the real world or across many contexts people come to hold these beliefs in the first place. Right? So I guess that's the best I can do at this point.
Great. Tom, I saw your mic just turned on.
Oh, yeah. I think I agree with everything you said in response to my comment. I wanted to take another shot, just to give you the idea, because I didn't do a good job of explaining my comment about the third character I was trying to put on the table. And this is, again, trying to put pressure on your notion of prejudice. The kind of case I was going for. So you got the case. So take the paradigm, which kind of brings together your notion of prejudice and the one I was floating together. So we all agree this is like a paradigm when the person has the negatively valenced belief about the group in advance of any evidence this is true of them or something like that, then it's like, okay, we all agree that's the prejudice case. I was thinking, to try to put pressure on the way you're thinking of prejudice has to involve this particular content. You could imagine somebody who I think we'd ordinarily count as prejudiced against a group, where here's how that manifests itself. Not that they jump to any kind of beliefs with a negative content, but they refuse to believe good things about the group, even when there's lots of evidence, right? So I was imagining somebody who, try to put pressure on your notion where the content of what they're believing about the group is actually not, the content itself doesn't suggest they're worse. It's just they're no better. They're no better or no worse. When in fact, what they should be believing is, no, this group really does do well with respect to this, right? They're kind of, and I was thinking of intuitively the ordinary notion, that's a way of being prejudiced, both prejudiced against a group, is refusing to acknowledge when they're beating the norm. And the beliefs will also have that kind of, I mean, that's slightly artificial, but that's at least the kind of, and I think you don't need to say anything new. I think based on your previous response to my comments, I know this kind of thing you're going to say about this, but that's at least the case I was going for, to put pressure on the idea that you need the negatively valenced content. No, what if the content is, you're not saying, it doesn't itself put the group down, but it's more negative than the content should be relative to the reality and the evidence and so on.
Yeah, okay. So I see the point now. That is interesting. So not negative per se, neutral, or simply not having beliefs in the area where the evidence suggests that one should have beliefs and so on. So then I would certainly say, right, that these people are doing something wrong, namely neglecting relevant evidence. The question is whether we could say that they are neglecting relevant evidence because they are prejudiced. Then I'm going to have a problem, because I would say the prejudice is in the beliefs that they have, not in how they process the evidence or something like that. Okay, yeah, I get it. That's a nice way of trying to put the finger on the awkwardness here of trying to align the concept with all of these different diverging uses, right? So I do think, as a matter of fact, that current discourse is hopelessly confused about extensional and intentional specifications of the concept, that we move swiftly from one to the other without really thinking about what's going on. So in philosophical discourse, then you sort of need to be clear. And then I ended up going with the extensional account, so as to ask the question, how well does the extensional account map onto the intentional account?
Yeah, and just to be clear, I'm repeating something I said, but I think that your case that, yeah, these paradigms, women are less adept at math, you make a completely convincing case. These can be rationally held. And moreover, sometimes even though you put it, I think understates the significance of the thesis, because we might think that, well, yeah, there's the possibility claim, but maybe it wouldn't be so interesting if, well, you need to go for the kinds of fancy examples epistemologists have to devise and so on. But no, it really is like, no, this is like, closed possible worlds. This is happening, right?
Yeah, exactly. So there is one thing I want to say, though, about the having or not having beliefs about certain groups and so on. So I toy around a little bit with an example of what is it, like Hondas are the best mid-priced cars or something like that, right? That is a belief about Toyotas as well, in a certain way. So you could say, look, I have no prejudice against Toyotas. I just happen to believe that Hondas are the best mid-priced Japanese car. But as a matter of fact, you do have a belief about Toyotas if you have that belief about Hondas. I think in many cases, like the sort of the very nearby entailments of our beliefs counts as beliefs for the purposes of classification here as well. So I suspect that something like that might also be going around in the case where someone just doesn't form the belief even though they have the evidence. There's going to be some nearby stuff in which they do form some beliefs as well, or they form comparative beliefs which have simple entailments that would be prejudiced and so on. But once again, I take your point.
And Renee, you have a question.
Yeah, well, so I was pretty sympathetic to the response that you gave, appealing to the possibility of social learning and highlighting that there is some parallel between the propositional underdetermination of testimony in overt cases and what you might get in social learning. But I wanted I think that makes more urgent the question, what is it to behave or act according to a stereotype? Because the question that's still bothering me is something like, how much distance between the behavior observed and the proposition that I'm going to take it to be evidence for preserves rational entitlement to treat the observation as evidence. So it feels like there must be at some point, I'm just too far from what I've actually observed to treat it as a rational basis for increasing my credence, or there's too much underdetermination.
Yeah, okay. So I guess I had in mind some fairly straightforward cases, like not taking the word in class because one fears that by taking the word in class and pursuing a certain kind of argument, one can get branded as, you know, problematic or pushy or something like that. So then by not taking the word in class, one implicitly then one conforms to the stereotype of a certain personality as being meek or shy or something like that. That would be the kind of behavior that I had in mind. Now, does that generalize to all? Now that you're putting your putting your finger on it, I'm starting to think like that's not going to be very typical, right? There's not like that one unique behavior that sort of confirms stereotypes. So I'm going to have to think more about that. I would love to get back to you at some point with it, right? So like, what are the many cases? I was starting from, you know, the sort of Herbert Clark style idea of, using stereotypical classifications of communication partners as the basis for, presumptive common ground, and then making adjustments as you go along. But also then, the communication partner will know, or at least reasonably suspect, that you are, stereotyping me in these ways, and then I will have incentive to comply with that because communication is just going to be so much easier. So unless there's like really, really significant stakes for me in making sure that you know that I'm like Norwegian and not Swedish or something like that, right? Then I'm just going to let it pass, right? So there, it seems like they have no particular problems, sort of, thinking about the ways in which people conform to stereotypes, or at least like don't rock the boat, I don't do anything to sort of upset your assumptions about me. This seems to be an intentional strategy, at least at some level of intention that I can deploy and so on. So, conforming to stereotypes there in that literature at least seems to be something they take to be so obvious that it doesn't really, warrant the question. So, but I see now, right, then when you're asking the questions, like, yeah, it's not going to be obvious how stereotype conforming behavior manifests across all of these contexts, such that someone could just see, oh yeah, I get it, I'm right now, or I now observe women and this is how they behave in context. Look at these, particular examples. So I think it's an excellent question, and no straight answer to it. Just gonna have to think more.
Endre, we really have to credit you with adding both content and structure to what's emerging to be a wide-spanning, a growing body of literature on the epistemology of prejudice. And so really want to thank you for your time presenting your work to us here. And we want to thank the critics for the time they put into studying Endre's work, thinking through it, and helping him and others see ways in which we can continue to advance our thought on the epistemology of prejudice. One of the failures of Zoom is you don't get the satisfying hand clapping, like reverberations moving through a room where you feel truly thanked, but you can just simulate that and know we're quite grateful. Before we wrap up entirely, I noticed that there's several people who are joining us from the internet. Is there any short questions you might have for Endre at this point? All right, with no immediate takers, I think we'll conclude. Thank you all again. A pleasure to host this.
Yeah, and thank you again to Paul and everyone else at the Concept Center. Thank you to Renee, Giulia, and Tom for serving as critics. Real honor for me to be part of this. Okay.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Wonderful. Bye-bye, guys.
Thanks.